ينفقون قل العفو كذلك يبين الله لكم الآيات لعلكم تتفكرون. الله أكبر. سمع الله لمن حمده. اللهم اهدنا فيمن هديت وعافنا فيمن عافيت وتولنا فيمن توليت وبارك لنا فيما أعطيت وقنا واصرف عنا برحمتك شر ما قضيت فإنك تقضي ولا يقضى عليك إنه لا يذل من واليت ولا يعز من عاديت تباركت ربنا وتعاليت فلك الحمد على ما قضيت ولك الشكر على ما أعطيت. نستغفرك اللهم من جميع الذنوب والخطايا ونتوب إليك. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله.
Family. So we'll do Iftar and Taraweeh here. So please.
Nahmaduhu wa nusalli ala rasulihil kareem. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. I begin in the name of the God whose mercy is profound, whose kindness is forever. Last night we did Surah Al-Baqarah from verse 1 to 142, 41. We have done up to verse 252 tonight. I mentioned the fact that the relationship between Surah Al-Fatiha and the rest of the Quran is a relationship of a prayer and a response to the prayer. In the first part of Surah Al-Baqarah, from 1 to 141, the Almighty addressed the children of Israel and informed them clearly that if they enjoyed a status in the eyes of the Almighty, it was because He made them the representatives of His message. Now that over a period of long time it has been observed that their performance has been lacking by and large, we find that the subsequent verses from 142 onwards, the Almighty is now declaring that He is transferring the obligation, responsibility of His representation of His message to the children of Ismail. So from 142 to 162, these verses are called them verses of transition. It's a transfer of status of God's representatives from the children of Israel to the children of Ismail. The way it has been done is by making an announcement that the Qibla is now being shifted from Jerusalem to Mecca. Jerusalem obviously representing the children of Israel and Mecca representing the children of Ismail. Verse 143 is an important, significant verse which mentions the fact that the Almighty has now announced, is making a formal announcement that the followers of the last prophet, may God's mercy be on him, are now shuhada ala nas. They are the representatives of God's message for the rest of the mankind. Kazalika ja'alnakum ummatan wasata. That's what the Almighty says. Thus we have made you an ummah which is in the middle of the two sources, the messenger on the one side and the rest of the mankind on the other. Why has He done it? Why has He chosen these people belonging to the children of Israel, Ismail, who are the companions of the Prophet? لِتَكُونُوا شُهَدَاءَ عَلَى النَّاسِ, so that you become God's representatives for the mankind. وَيَكُونَ الرَّسُولُ عَلَيْكُمْ شَهِيدًا, and the messenger becomes a representative for you. He delivers God's message to you and you deliver it to the rest of the mankind. From verse 163 onwards, what we find is that the Almighty is now addressing the children of Ismail and Muslims, because we all belong to now that group, they being the leaders and we being the periphery, the followers. The Almighty mentions the expectations of His religion to the believers, and it begins, not surprisingly, by a mention of emphasis on Tawheed, the unity of God. So verse 163, which is formally the beginning point of the address to the children of Ismail, says, "Wa ilahukum ilahum wahid." Be absolutely clear that your God, deity, the entity who needs to be worshipped and sought help from, is only one God. La ilaha illahu, there is no other deity except Him. And He is the one who is forgiving and merciful. The next verse, 164, is providing evidences of the claim that there is only one God. So it mentions, إِنَّ فِي خَلْقِ السَّمَاوَاتِ وَالْأَرْضِ وَاخْتِلَافِ اللَّيْلِ وَالنَّهَارِ وَالْفُلْكِ الَّتِي تَجْرِي فِي الْبَحْرِ, and up till the end it says, indeed of the heavens and the earth, and in the alternating night and day, and in the ships that sail with the cargo which benefits humans, and what God sends down from the sky in the form of rainfall, and He spreads across living beings, and in directing of winds, and the clouds that are controlled and they are between the sky and the earth, there are signs for the people who use their intellect. Signs of His attributes of providence He's providing humans with whatever they need. Signs the fact that he is wise, of the fact that he is knowledgeable, of the fact that he is controlling everything in a way that they are all harmoniously enabling the system that the Almighty has created to function. There's no chaos. It's all done in a way that it's disciplined. Verse 177 is an important verse, which is talking about the spirit, the gist of the Almighty's Sharia, His expectations from us practically. It begins by saying, لَيْسَ الْبِرَّ أَن تُوَلُّوا وُجُوهَكُمْ قِبَلَ الْمَشْرِقِ وَالْمَغْرِبِ. Piety and loyalty to the Almighty doesn't lie in the fact that you turn your faces towards the east or the west. Religious people normally think that if they are able to follow certain rituals, they have done the job. The Almighty says, not at all. That's not what He expects from you. وَلَكِنَّ الْبِرَّ مَنْ آمَنَ بِاللَّهِ. He goes on to mention in this one small verse all that He expects from us, and goes on to say that true loyalty to God and piety doesn't require that you just turn your faces towards the east or the west, but true loyalty and piety is that of the one who genuinely believes in God and the last day and the angels and the book and the prophets. And he gives his wealth in the way of the Almighty, despite the fact that he loves his wealth, to relatives, to orphans, the needy, the travelers, and those who ask. And he spends his wealth for freeing slaves. He establishes regular prayers and pays zakat, the annual due on his wealth. And he's the one who fulfills his promises as and when he makes a promise. And these people in particular are the ones who persevere during periods of economic crisis and ill health, illnesses, and in the battlefield. The Almighty says, أُولَٰئِكَ الَّذِينَ صَدَقُوا. They are the ones who are truthful in their claims that they are believers and loyal to the Almighty. وَأُولَٰئِكَ هُمُ الْمُتَّقُونَ. They are the ones who are truly God conscious. Thereafter, what we find is that the Almighty is mentioning the expectations of Sharia in a certain logical sequence. The sequence is this, that he begins by the mention of the sanctity of life, which is represented by the law of retribution, qisas, followed by sanctity of wealth, wherein he mentions the law that requires us to write wills, something that was important when the law of inheritance wasn't revealed as yet. These two expectations of the Sharia are followed by the famous verses that have got to do with the month of Ramadan and fasting. The link is that when you follow the Sharia, you can't do it unless you're God conscious. And fasting enables us to become God conscious. And then comes the expectation of doing Hajj. That's something which all Muslims living in Medina had a very strong yearning that they would want to do it. But the trouble was that the house of God where Hajj was to be done was invaded by, under the control of the polytheists of Mecca, and they would not allow Muslims to enter Mecca, and therefore jihad, battle was necessitated. So we find a discussion on jihad. Jihad could not have been undertaken in those times unless you spent your wealth in the way of God, because you needed the equipment through which the battle was to be fought. So infaq, spending in the way of God, is also what we find mentioned. When you fight a battle, especially talking about those days, obviously people would get killed. When some people would get killed, they will leave behind orphans and widows. And one of the solutions that the Almighty suggested in those days was that Muslims should get married to those widows, and therefore there is a mention of nikah. When you talk about nikah, you've got to talk about talaq as well, because this is one possible eventuality. The discussion on divorce is also accompanied by a discussion on iddah, the waiting period which widows and divorcees are to go through before they are allowed to get married again. When all this has been mentioned, then the discussion returns to the mention of jihad, which is where today's verses complete. So we move on to the mention of the month of Ramadan. The Almighty says that the Almighty requires us to fast during this month, لَعَلَّكُمْ تَتَّقُونَ, so that you may become God conscious. We become God conscious through fasting because we deprive ourselves of food and drink, despite the fact that we have the potential to consume them, and we need to eat and drink, but it's only because we know that the Almighty expects us not to consume them that we restrain ourselves, we check our impulses and inclinations. That's what God conscious is all about, that you follow the Almighty's expected discipline despite the fact that there are inclinations within you to do wrong. And the Almighty says that this He has done to make sure that because the Quran was revealed during the month of Ramadan, and the Quran is a book of guidance, and it's a clear guidance, and it's a book that distinguishes clear between right and wrong. This source of immense significance has been given to the Muslims. He wants them to thank Him and to glorify Him. So fasting is a way of glorifying the Almighty. لِتُكَبِّرُ اللَّهَ عَلَى مَا هَدَاكُمْ. How do we glorify by fasting? Well, we are hungry and we are thirsty, and this experience we are going through for no other reason because our Creator has asked us to go through this exercise of fasting. Thereafter, we have this mention of Hajj and Jihad, but it begins interestingly by this question that some people had raised. وَيَسْأَلُونَكَ عَنِ الْأَهِلَّةِ. They ask you about Ahilla. Ahilla is the plural of Hilal, and Hilal is crescent, the moon that you see in the horizon on the first of every lunar month. This sighting of moon was necessitated because we needed to know about months, lunar months, and here it's referring to particularly the sacred months, the 4 months. So the Almighty says, يَسْأَلُونَكَ عَنِ الْأَهِلَّةِ. They ask you about the sacred months. The word used is ahilla, crescent, but the real meanings that are meant to be understood are the meaning of sacred months. And thereafter, the discussion on Hajj begins, and the Almighty talks about those aspects of Hajj which are needed to be taken as the Almighty's expectations with true spirit. He talks about some of those aspects of Hajj which the people of Mecca and the polytheists were doing, but they were doing it wrong. So it's not something that we find in the Quran that we are given a complete guidance on how to do Hajj. The Hajj was already being undertaken by people, and it was only some of the mistakes that they committed and the spirit that was missing that was highlighted to be created once again. Then the Almighty goes on to mention in verse 213 the fact that He has arranged for His book to be there with people so that whenever there are religious differences, they can sort them out in the light of the book. The purpose of the book is لِيَحْكُمَ بَيْنَ النَّاسِ فِي مَا اخْتَلَفُوا فِيهِ, so that they may distinguish between right and wrong in religious matters in the light of what the book says. And then we move on to the next few passages where the Almighty raises the questions that were raised by the people who were following the Quran, and they were unable to understand some aspects of religion. He asks their questions, mentions them, and then answers those questions. He talks about the fact that despite the reality that He wants people to get married to the widows, He would not like Muslim men to get married to ladies who are mushrikat who have polytheistic views. Likewise, Muslim women are not allowed to get married to men who are mushrik, who have beliefs which are polytheistic. Then begins the discussion on divorce, and the Almighty, in the law of divorce that He has mentioned, the spirit of it is that divorce should be avoided. If at all a decision is taken, it should be a well thought decision. Even while the divorce proceedings are going on, there should be a relationship of mutual respect between the spouses. There should be an opportunity of reconsidering the decision that has been taken by the husband, and therefore, within the iddat period, the waiting period, the Almighty has allowed the husband to reconcile. And He says that this is something which every believing man should follow. While the discussion of talaq, divorce, and iddat, waiting period is going on, within those verses, somewhere is inserted the requirement of being careful about our prayers. The idea is that we cannot follow God's Sharia, His laws properly, unless we are mindful of our prayers. We take our prayers seriously, because it's only when we pray regularly that we are reminded of God and we are God conscious. And when we are God conscious, it's only then that we can follow His law in true letter and spirit. After the discussion of talaq, which was necessitated because there was a mention of nikah, that in turn was necessitated because there was a discussion on jihad. We return to a discussion on jihad towards the end of this whole passage, wherein the Almighty talks about the fact that the Muslims, whenever there is a need for jihad, must undertake it, and gives the example of the story of Talut and Jalut, Saul and Goliath, and mentions the fact that in the history of the religious people, there have been times that the Almighty required them to undertake jihad. Some people who were truly believing, they went ahead and did what the Almighty expected from them, and there were others who failed in the expectations because they were not up to the standards of commitment that the Almighty had set forth for them. After having mentioned the story of Saul and Goliath, the Almighty towards the end, the last verse 252 says, Tilka ayatullahi natluha alayka bil haqq. These are the verses that we are reciting before you in truth. They are absolutely correct. Wa innaka laminal mursaleen, and you indeed, O Prophet, are a messenger of God. That is, there is no way that you could have given the details of the story of Saul and Goliath, which is mentioned in Bible, fine. But what is mentioned in Bible is not exactly the same as what has been mentioned in the Quran. The Quran does mention some of those facts, but mentions certain other things which are different. In fact, in some passages contradicting what the Bible is saying. And the Quran mentions most emphatically that what the Quran is saying is the ultimate truth, and this is for no other reason except that you, O Prophet, are the messenger of God. أقول قولي هذا واستغفر الله لي ولكم.